Europe's toughest policies affecting Muslim communities weren't introduced by the far right. They came from Denmark's left-wing Social Democrats, the very party that built its reputation on equality. And now, Europe's top court says part of that project may be illegal. Here's the thesis. A government that built its entire political identity on equality just spent 7 years running a housing policy that Europe's own courts say singles people out by ethnicity. And the reckoning for that contradiction is only just beginning. To understand how strange this is, you have to remember what Denmark used to represent. For decades, this was the model. High taxes, high trust, a cradle-to-grave welfare system, and a self-image as one of the most open, egalitarian societies on the continent. Danish social democracy wasn't just a party platform. It was practically a national identity. Nobody left behind, nobody sorted by where they came from. Nobody left outside the system. So, when Mette Frederiksen's government pushed forward a law that classifies entire neighborhoods by the ethnic background of the people living in them, it didn't look like Denmark. It looked like a reversal of everything the party claimed to stand for. This is a prime minister who took office in 2019 openly stating she wanted asylum numbers driven down to 0. That alone would have been remarkable coming from a social democrat. What came next was more remarkable still. Except the government never saw any of it as a reversal. And here's the paradox that makes this story worth telling. Officials frame this not as abandoning equality, but as enforcing it. The argument goes like this. Genuine integration requires shared neighborhoods, shared schools, a shared language. If some areas are allowed to become self-contained enclaves, the state believes it is failing those communities, not protecting them. From inside that logic, breaking up concentrated low-income immigrant neighborhoods isn't discrimination. It's what a government that actively believes in equality is supposed to do. Sort the map by outcome, not by identity, they'd say. Even when the sorting criteria runs straight through ethnicity. So, let's walk through how far that logic actually went, because this didn't stop at one law. The first front was legal architecture. Back in 2018, Denmark passed what it originally called the Ghetto Law, later rebranded the Parallel Societies Law. A neighborhood gets flagged if more than half its residents are non-Western immigrants or their descendants, plus at least 2 more markers: unemployment, low education, low income, or a crime rate several times the national average. At its peak, the list ran to 22 areas, home to a share of Denmark's roughly 500,000 non-Western immigrants. Once an area is flagged, the law forces public housing associations to cut social housing down to 40% of the neighborhood by 2030, through new construction, conversion, or outright demolition. Then it went further. More than $1 billion was set aside just for tearing down or converting these buildings. Landlords were given easier legal paths to evict tenants to speed the process along. Residents in Copenhagen's Mjølnerparken and in the Schackenborg Vænge estate near Ringsted had their leases terminated, and by their own account, more than 1,000 people were pushed out of homes many had lived in for years, sometimes decades. Then it went further again. Children as young as 1 in flagged areas were required to attend mandatory daycare built around Danish language and Danish values, 30 hours a week, with the threat of losing child benefits for parents who refused, even though native Danish parents faced no such requirement. Crimes committed inside these zones carried harsher sentences than the same crimes committed a few streets away. Benefits themselves were reduced for residents inside the boundary lines, explicitly to make staying there, in the government's own language, economically less attractive. Municipalities that succeeded in moving immigrants into jobs were paid a bonus for each one. And then came the legal challenge nobody in government seemed to expect. Residents sued in 2020. Their lawyer, Eddie Kawaja, argued it was hard to see how an ethnic criterion could seriously be called neutral. Community Chair Mohammed Oslam put it more bluntly. After living in Denmark since he was 7 and raising 4 children in that same estate who went on to become working professionals, he said the policy punished families who had done nothing wrong, and that it followed years of politicians competing over who could say the harshest things about immigrants to win votes. Then came the escalation almost nobody predicted. In February, the European Court of Justice's own Advocate General, Tamara Chapeta, concluded the law amounted to direct ethnic discrimination, not incidental, not a side effect, direct. She argued the non-Western label wasn't really describing a coherent ethnic group at all, but rather everyone the Danish legislature had decided didn't count as Western. And in December, the full court followed with a preliminary ruling agreeing the law could indeed violate the EU's race equality directive, sending the case back to Denmark's own courts for the final word. Meanwhile, the government kept building on the very same foundation the court was questioning. Just weeks before that ruling landed, Copenhagen moved to extend its existing face-covering ban, the so-called burqa ban, out of public streets and into classrooms and universities, framed explicitly as protecting women and girls from what officials called outdated honor culture. Following a government-commissioned women's rights inquiry earlier in the year, the same proposal went further still, adding plans to criminalize informal mediation councils and to stiffen sentences for so-called honor-related crimes. It's worth pausing on that face veil ban specifically because Denmark wasn't inventing the idea, it was importing one. France moved first, back in 2011, becoming the first European country to ban full face veils nationwide, justified at the time as a matter of liberty and women's dignity rather than religion. But the numbers behind that original French law tell their own story. The research used to justify it estimated roughly 1,900 women wore burqas in France that year, a tiny fraction of the country's Muslim population. And one later investigation found the real figure was closer to a few hundred. Belgium, Bulgaria, Austria, and the Netherlands all followed with versions of their own. Denmark, extending that same logic into schools, puts it in that same lineage. A policy whose reach keeps expanding well past the scale of the problem it was supposedly built to solve. Stack all of those pieces together, and what you have isn't a housing policy anymore. It's a doctrine, a governing philosophy that treats ethnic composition as a legitimate variable for policy. Applied consistently across housing, education, criminal sentencing, and now public dress, all filed under the same banner of integration. And that's exactly why this reaches past Denmark's own borders. This is the government other European leaders have spent years quietly studying. Its hardline asylum posture has already shaped policy conversations in Sweden and, more recently, in the UK. France was first to ban full-face veils nationwide back in 2011, and Belgium, Bulgaria, Austria, and the Netherlands have all followed with their own versions since. What the EU court just did was tell every government watching Denmark's playbook that at least the ethnic classification piece of it may not survive legal scrutiny in Brussels. And a ruling like that, once it exists, can't quietly be shelved. But before anyone calls this a landmark human rights victory, this is where honesty matters. Here's the supportive case. The government points to results, not just intentions. Parallel society neighborhoods have dropped from 8 down to 5 in a single year, with several areas coming off the list entirely as crime and education indicators improved. Officials argue that fewer segregated blocks means more children growing up around parents who are employed and educated, and fewer neighbors with criminal convictions. Ministers frame the dress code expansion the same way, insisting it defends the autonomy of women and girls from families who might otherwise pressure them to stay covered rather than targeting them for who they are. Here's the critical case. The UN, Amnesty International, and Denmark's own Institute for Human Rights have all flagged essentially the same core problem the EU court just validated in Brussels. That people are losing their homes and facing harsher treatment based on the ethnic makeup of their street, not anything they personally did. Legal advocates call it a day of reckoning for a state that ignored these warnings for years, while families were relocated and buildings came down. One international rights lawyer went further, describing the whole package as one chapter in a much longer history of political rhetoric and legislation that has consistently singled out minority communities. There's a political story underneath the legal one, too. Political analysts tracking Denmark say mainstream parties spent more than a decade absorbing the rhetoric of the anti-immigration right instead of resisting it, which pulled the country's entire political spectrum rightward on immigration, even as the traditional far-right party itself stayed contained in the polls, seemingly because its ideas had already been adopted by the mainstream. A housing dispute in one town years ago, sparked by a decision to fund a community celebration for Eid, instead of a Christmas tree, became a symbol for exactly that shift. Proof, to critics, that once fringe grievances about immigrants had migrated into ordinary local politics. Younger, minority voters in Denmark now describe watching that same normalization play out in their own universities and workplaces, saying rhetoric that would once have been confined to the political fringe now shows up in mainstream policy debates. Both of those things can be true at the same time. A government can genuinely believe it is engineering equality and still build a machine that a European court says treats people differently because of their ethnicity. The law never needed to use the word race to sort people by it. It just needed a definition of non-Western, precise enough to draw a map, and vague enough to defend into court. Remember where this started. The toughest policies affecting Muslim communities anywhere in Europe didn't come from the far right. They came from the party of the welfare state, from the politicians who built their brand on fairness. And it took Europe's own top court to say part of that project may not survive the law. So here's the question. This case leaves standing over Denmark and over every country now studying its model. If a policy built by the party of the welfare state can still be found discriminatory by Europe's own courts, what does that actually say about the rest of the continent's integration playbook? Drop your honest take in the comments. We read all of them. And subscribe to Allied Nations. The next reckoning is already being written.